Hi, my name is Moninya Roughan. I'm a professor of oceanography at UNSW Sydney. So thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. I'm going to be talking about the observing system that we've developed in the East Australian Current. It's the first of two talks today about the East Australian Current, with the goal of guiding observing system requirements for the physics of the ocean and to link the global observing system to regional coastal observing systems. So hopefully what I present today will promote conversation and collaboration between both the modelling and observing communities, but also between well-observed systems and less well-observed systems. So the East Australian Current is a strong poleward flowing western boundary current that flows along the east coast of Australia. As you can see here, it flows down the coast to about 30 to 32 degrees south, where it separates and sheds large mesoscale eddies. You can see some of these eddies shedding off here. We have temperature gradients of up to 7 degrees across the EAC front, and it transports heat and biota poleward. It's also a hotspot of ocean warming, as with other western boundary currents in the southern hemisphere, at least. It's warming at 2 to 3 times the global average. It is an ocean desert. We can see chlorophyll here in the image on the right. Some cyclonic eddies drive productivity, particularly further south where productivity increases, but also the interface between cyclonic and anticyclonic eddies. The eddy field drives biota, retains larvae and returns them to the shelf. Also transports eggs, larvae, kelp, spores, nutrients, etc. Poleward. So we have loads of questions about the EAC. What's the mean, the variability of the EAC system? What's the transport of the system, the volume and heat transport? Does it encroach on the shelf and how frequently? What's the impact of that encroachment? Does it drive upwelling? Where does it separate? How frequently? Is there variability in all of these things? The eddy shedding, does it have a seasonal cycle? What are the submesoscale dynamics, the structure of the jet, the depth of the jet, and the space and range of the eddies that form in the system? What are the drivers of cross-shelf transport, shelf-ocean exchange? How frequent is it? What's the variability? What's the productivity associated with it? What's the biological impact? So what drives or increases or decreases productivity? Is there coastal retention? Is there export? And what drives the transport of biota? These questions are quite common across boundary current systems, I believe. Finally, what's the impact of environmental change? Changes to the mean flow, rate of ocean warming. Is it uniform with latitude, with time and space? What's the impact of that? What are the characteristics and drivers of marine heat waves? And finally, how well can we model and predict the system? What processes can we model and predict, and at what scales? So these are some of the goals that have driven the development of our observing system over the last 2 decades. So I'm very fortunate that I arrived back in Australia back in 2006, right at the start of Australia's integrated marine observing system. It has a number of strategic goals. Firstly, to assemble and provide free, open and timely access to data streams that support research. It is a research infrastructure scheme, and we've had to evolve over the last 15 years. We're supporting research on the role of the oceans in the climate system, supporting research on the interaction between major boundary currents and coastal and shelf environments and ecosystems, and support research on the conservation of biodiversity. I'm really going to be focusing on that middle point here today, boundary current system and the shelf interactions. And in the longer term, the goal of the infrastructure is to support social, environmental and economic outcomes of national benefit, but bearing in mind that this was a top-down research-driven program. So the program is now guided by a bunch of node science plans. We have 6 regional nodes: Western Australian node, Northern Australian node, New South Wales IMOS, Victorian IMOS, South Australian IMOS, and Southeastern Australian IMOS. And we have a blue water and climate node. We have a national science and implementation plan that we brought together in 2015. So it's one national plan, and there are 6 node chapters focused on the open ocean and the regional marine systems. We wrote our node science plans as regional nodes, and then we came together and looked at the similarities and the differences, and there were very few differences in the science questions. So we were able to distill the science questions into these 5 main themes: multi-decadal change, climate variability, continental shelf processes, separation and boundary current dynamics, and the ecosystem response to all of these things. So each of these 5 themes are at the heart of most of the observing systems around Australia. The program's been funded by the Australian government to the tune of about 200 million Australian dollars since 2006, but there's been more than dollar for dollar co-investment. For example, in 2019-20, we received 21 million from the government and $35 million in co-investment for that year. All these node plans and reports are freely available on the web, and there's a bunch of papers. These ones here describe our system along the east coast of Australia. So how is it implemented? The funding actually flows to facilities. We have 11, I think, IMOS facilities that support the infrastructure that we use to observe the ocean. So here, the schematic diagram shows the range of facilities that we have in operation, and they are national facilities, and the community has access to the platforms that observe the ocean through these facilities. The coordinated approach to observing through facilities drives cooperation, but it also reduces redundancy. I think in small countries or big countries with small populations and small tax user base, eliminating redundancies or competition between groups is very important, and stopping the duplication of efforts. So this has worked very well in our case. So we have a deep water mooring facility, an Argo float facility, biologging facility, ocean gliders, autonomous vehicles, a national mooring network that's supported by sub-facilities around the country, and I lead our national mooring sub-facility on my coast. My marine microbial initiative, animal tracking, coastal ocean radar, satellite remote sensing, and most importantly, our data portal, the Australian Ocean Data Network, where we provide our data. So after 15 years of observing the East Australian current, I'm happy to say that it really is a fairly well observed boundary current. So this is an overview from the Todd boundary current paper that was published in 2019. This shows our time series lines of XBTs, a bunch of our repeat glider lines along the east coast of Australia and down off Tasmania. These are our ships of opportunity lines. Our time series lines are the moorings. Here we have deep water moorings and then shelf moorings all the way down the coast, and also research vessel cruises up and down the coast. We've been running these XBT lines since 1991 quarterly at 10 to 15 kilometre resolution, 10 kilometre resolution across the jet and further course of resolution offshore. They're the 3 XBT lines that define what we call the Tasman box. We also have continuous plankton recorder lines up and down the coast here. We have long range and short range HF radar, and we have all our remote sensing, satellite remote sensing contributions from international agencies and teams. The shelf system is where I've largely been involved, and I have led our ocean observing program along the east coast of Australia for the last 15 years. My team deploy moorings at Coffs Harbour up here at Sydney and at Narooma. So we have 3 moorings off Coffs Harbour, 4 moorings off Sydney, and 2 moorings now down off southern New South Wales. These are roughly at 30 south, 34 south and 36 south, and they augment the deep water transport array that's up off Brisbane. And we've had hydrographic sampling at this Port Hacking site off Sydney down here since 1942, which is rather remarkable. We also have repeat glider lines, which we run down the east coast, and I'll talk more about them. So firstly, the deep water observations. These are led by Bernadette Sloyan, who you can see up here in the corner. She's been responsible for this transport array at 27 South, which is where the EAC jet is thought to be most coherent. It's been deployed since 2012. You can see the time series of transport here. And you can see there was a significant gap due to funding issues, and it has continued since that time, since 2015. And we're working towards a 10-year time series at the moment. We have observations of temperature, salinity and velocity through the water column down to 4,000, 5,000 metres depth and out to 150 kilometres offshore. And it's the first long-term observations of the transport in the EAC. And it's revealed how variable the core is while we thought it was the most coherent part of the system, which it is, about 10% of the time, the jet is deflected well offshore by cyclonic eddies that form and hug the coast and grow. And these cyclonic eddies impact transport and productivity. So along the shelf, as I said, I've led our mooring program along the shelf. We have moorings at Coffs Harbour, Sydney and Narooma at these 3 latitudes here where these boxes are. They're upward looking ADCPs and thermistor strings through the water column. We now have salinity top and bottom below the surface. They're subsurface moorings for security, site security and longevity. This is an example here of one of our ADCPs going into the water. And we have temperature and pressure and then velocity every 5 minutes at 8-metre intervals through the water column. The moorings are in depths of 50, 70, 100 and 140 metres of water out across the shelf. The shelf's very narrow, so the moorings are within 30 kilometres of the shelf. We have, we deployed our first moorings back in 2008, and we've had near continuous coverage at some of our sites. You can see here, this is a spatial plot from 2008 through to 2021. You can see the different variables that we've measured with time, but largely we've been very consistent with our temperature and velocity observations at these locations. We've been able to measure the variability in the system. As you can see, highly variable temperature. This is our long shelf velocities, blue poleward, red northward, and the range here is about 1 metre a second in either direction in our cross shelf current. So highly variable system. We're also able to measure the means. Now we have 10, 15 years of data. We can start to understand the means in the system, the seasonality, the vertical structure through the water column. It is a remarkable data set, 5-minute data at 8-metre intervals through the water column. And there have been loads of papers that have looked at the dynamics of the system in the region. And this is both upstream of the ESC separation and downstream of the separation. You can see the impact here of the jet and where it separates from the shelf. So jet dominated and eddy dominated regions. We have HF radar systems at 2 locations, one high resolution WIRA system up off Coffs Harbour at 30 degrees south, which is upstream of EAC separation. And we have a long range system downstream of EAC separation, which goes out to about 300 to 400 kilometres offshore at 6K resolution. And here's a photo here, our long range CODAR and our short range WIRA system. The WIRA system is about 100 kilometres square, or the range is 100 kilometres square, which gets us to the other side of the EAC jet, which is remarkable. So from this data, we're able to understand the mean and the variability of the spatial variability of the currents and the temporal variability. We can also see these unique cyclonic eddies that form on the inside edge of the EAC at times. One thing that I'll point out is that with analogous observations, we're able to do genuine comparisons. So we did some work comparing the upstream Florida current with the upstream East Australian current. And we're able to do that because we had analogous observations of the surface velocities from WIRA HF radar systems at 1 kilometre resolution. We're able to really compare apples with apples. It's one of the first times that this has happened in our boundary current systems. So I do recommend when building new systems that you look to some of the other observations in the Western boundary currents and try to build upon the observations that are available. Excuse me. Another thing that we've done is run deep water gliders across the observing system. We've run deep water gliders across the EAC transport array up off 27 South to see what the benefit of these deep water gliders and what they give to us, or what observations they contribute that the transport array doesn't contribute. So I'll run that animation again. See our deep water moorings, the gliders. We've had an experiment. We had 4 gliders running around the mooring array. And as you can expect, they interpolate in space and time between the moorings, which is really very, very valuable. But you can also see with this track here that it's very difficult in a Western boundary current to get an endurance line, for example. Actually, it's impossible to get endurance lines in Western boundary currents. But they do fill the spatial gap and they do fill the variable gap. So we get all the biogeochemical variables that you don't get from moored observations necessarily. In the shelf waters, you can see here there's a little animation of all our glide emissions. We've run them started upstream and then ran them down the shelf out to about 150 meters depth down the shelf. And this is progression through time here. You can see how many glider missions we've run. After 5 years of doing this, the northern third of the state, we moved down and now we're running the second third of the state for the next 5 years. And these give us very, very good resolution across the shelf. And you can see this sawtooth pattern as the glider going on and off the shelf. We're up to about 55 missions down the coast now. They're about 3 weeks each using a slocum glider. Out to 150 meters depth, measuring all the variables that slocums measure. And we run them 4 times a year. Halfway through the program, we released a scientific data paper describing the data from 26 of these missions. So it must be time to do another paper now that we're over 50 missions. So another success is we have more than 60 years of subsurface temperature data. So going back to the 1940s at one location and the 1950s at this particular location. This is depth through the water column. This is temperature records from 1950 through to the start of IMOS. This was the start of IMOS in 2009 when we deployed a mooring, and you can now see what the mooring did for the resolution here through the water column. We have vertical CTD casts, and we also have 8 meter temperature data from at 5-minute intervals through the water column. So now that we have 60 plus years of in situ temperature data, we've been able to construct very rigorous temperature climatologies from that data. So we have the daily mean temperature over the 60 years and the 90th and 10th percentiles, which we're using for marine heatwave studies and marine cold spell studies, which is great. We've also been able to look at temperature gradients, trends, and the latitudinal gradient in temperature trends through the system. And what we found, this is a piece of work that came out earlier this year, was that the rate of warming is non-uniform with latitude. And in fact, the fastest warming is occurring down the southern half of the system between 36 and 42 south. And that rate of warming at 0.5 degrees per decade is more than double the rate of warming that we have up in the northern half of the system in the core of the EAC jet. So it really is this extension region where the jet is penetrating further south that's receiving the most rapid warming rate, or is experiencing the most rapid warming rate. So one of the cornerstones of the IMOS program is the Australian Ocean Data Network, which is this open access data portal. And the program was founded on the philosophy of open access data. And now we adhere to findable, accessible, interoperable, reproducible principles, FAIR principles, we call them. We have developed IMOS QA, QC conventions. We've developed IMOS file naming conventions. And all the files are CF compliant NetCDF files that are available through a metadata server, or the data portal and the metadata server, and through a thread server. And we've seen a step change in the amount of data that's been collected. So this is pre-IMOS here, and now this is post-IMOS. This is temperature data on the shelf. It's just a remarkable, and again, pre-IMOS temperature data versus post-IMOS temperature data. And really, we've shifted the mentality of the community towards open access data sharing, which I think is really very important. And all the data is available at the AODN, Australian Ocean Data Network.org.au. One of the other things we're doing is moving beyond data to products. So it's not just enough to just collect data for the sake of it. We actually have to develop data products. This has been more challenging for us as we are a research infrastructure, and my core business is not developing data products, but we're working very hard to do that. Here's an example of a marine heatwave product that we've developed using that temperature climatology and high resolution data. You can click through this web app and look at the number of days where we have marine heat waves and exceedances of the 90th percentile, and that's available online. Another of the strengths of our program is the integration between the modelling and the observing program. And I think my colleague Colette Kerry might also show this slide. We work very closely from the outset to collect our observations and integrate with the numerical modelling program through data assimilation. We've conducted observation impact experiments that show the benefits of the observations and what value they bring to us. And one of the really neat outcomes of this showed that subsurface temperature observations in regions of high variability really impact on the predictability and improves the quality of the modelling. Now, you might think that's a no-brainer, but we actually were able to show it through our observation impact experiments. And that fed back into smarter observing system design. So now we're putting effort into getting those subsurface observations of temperature and salinity. That feeds back into the numerical modelling and so on. In terms of gaps in the system, I think we're doing very well. As I said, the EAC is fairly well observed, but I can, of course, be highly critical and identify gaps as well. So firstly, as I said, we've done the northern part of the system with gliders, and now we're working on the central part of the system with gliders on the shelf, but we really, a very big gap is the southern third of the system. And this is that ocean warming hotspot, and it is the region where temperatures are warming at 0.5 degrees over the past decade. And yet we have very few observations apart from this one site where there are moorings. So we have no gliders in the southern third of the system. We don't have any observations, or very few observations, in the EAC outflow extension region. So below this map, it'd be great to get some moorings and some gliders like along the transport array. So we have the upstream condition. We need that southern outflow condition. We have moorings every 2 degrees at 27 south, at 30 south, at 34 south, and at 36 south. But there is a notable gap here at 32 south, or under this radar footprint here. So some more time series observations at 32 south would be useful. This is the EAC separation region. It's highly dynamic and it's a little more challenging to measure, which is why it wasn't instrumented in the first place. Unfortunately, the EAC transport array funding has been cut, and IMOS have said they won't renew that funding. And Bernadette Soyan and her colleagues are working very hard to sustain the funding for that array for another 18 months. It was recently deployed last month for 18 months. And they're trying to get continued funding for another 18-month period, which would bring the time series to 10 years, which makes it extremely valuable. But even every single day, every extra day is of value. Of course, we'd love radar along the whole coastline. That may or may not be feasible in the near future, but the observation impact studies have shown that the value of radar data, particularly where the eddy shedding occurs and is a very dynamic region. And finally, biologging could be improved in the system using animals as samplers. We have penguins in the south of the system and we have turtles in the north of the system. Taking advantage of these animals would really help improve our estimates of temperature and salinity, or observations of temperature and salinity in the region. Of course, it's very important to measure impact and societal benefit. IMOS have come some way towards this in recent years. We were not very good at it at the beginning. Initially, we were actually measured by the number of data sets we produced as part of our research infrastructure. But there are just different aspects of societal benefit and research infrastructure impact which need to be considered. We've started to develop case studies looking at impact, which this one is an example, looking at food security and what we do and how we contribute to food security, and which platforms through the observing system actually contribute to observations of food security. And this is also the beneficiaries here. So we've developed these impact case studies to be able to showcase the benefit of the system. So we were asked to provide some recommendations. So firstly, these are my recommendations on platforms, the optimum mix for processes. I think you need to find the sweet spot. There will always be trade-offs, and those trade-offs will vary depending on your system. Some of the trade-offs we had to consider were site security, longevity, spatial and temporal coverage, accessibility to ports and availability of boats, what variable you want to measure, and whether it be shelf versus deep water, who's funding the system, etc., what kind of investment you can get. I really recommend a mix of gear. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think radar at the surface and gliders below the surface with moorings at some points is a really nice combination. Radar gives you that spatial coverage. Gliders give you the variability, temporal variability in space, but moorings give you that temporal variability at a point in time, and that high resolution mooring data is invaluable. You need to be able to leverage international efforts, Argos, satellite, drifters, etc. And think about, well, you may not be able to launch a satellite yourself, but what can you contribute? Can you contribute regional algorithms, CalVal sites? Can you deploy Argo floats? Can you deploy drifters on behalf of other agencies? If you can provide boat time and logistical support, that's also very, very, very valuable. We've often had drifters donated to us to deploy in the ASC system, for example. I mentioned before that getting analogous observations across the different boundary currents allows for genuine comparisons, and I think that's very valuable. So working together to try and find that optimal mix of observations that allow us to compare the boundary currents and compare the changes that are going on will be extremely valuable. I think it's very important to remember that Rome wasn't built in a day. Keep it simple. Sustained is more important than complex. Start with subsurface temperature, whatever you can do. Have a vision, and then expand the system as time and funding permit. Grow that vision. I can tell you that 15 years passes very quickly. I can't believe I've been at this game for 15 years already. So lessons learned, engage with industry early, work with your stakeholders, ask them how you can solve their problems. This shows the maturity in our system, but it's taken us a long time to get to this point. I think it encourages co-investment. It'll encourage data uptake, which again supports longevity. The more people that use the data, the more valuable it becomes. A real tight integration of the data collection team and the data analysis teams. In my team, we have the modelling team, we have the technical team, and we have the observational team, and we all work really closely together. Those lines are all blurred between those teams, and that allows us to understand the complexities of the data sets and the nuances. It increases the value and significance of each other's work. And it also allows us to identify issues really quickly. Instead of just the tech team delivering data to the portal, which someone may or may not look at, my team are using that data very, very quickly and rapidly, looking at it, finding issues, correcting problems, and feeding that back to the national program, particularly if there are problems in data processing or some software has been released that had bugs in it, for example. We're constantly identifying quick issues or issues quickly and improving quickly and easily. I suggest you don't work in silos. You need national collaboration, international communication, data sharing, best practices. This drives innovation in data processing, QA, QC, best practice in deployments, comparison studies between systems, the dynamical understanding, and really tight engagement between the observation and the modelling team adds a lot of value to both. We're very aware of what's going on both sides, in both camps, as it were. Open access data, always, everywhere, at all times, is the future. And finally, moving beyond data sets to data products, I think, is very, very important. So thank you so much for your time. These are some of the people who've worked in my team over the years. I couldn't have done it without them. Massive thank you to IMOS, the Integrated Marine Observing System, which is a national collaborative research infrastructure supported by the Australian government. And thank you to my team.